Hi, everyone. This is Kevin, and thank you for joining me today for my webinar, Stop 5 Things Not to Do with Your EDM Implementation. So what I hope to convey in this webinar is we focus a lot on best practices and leading practices, and that's a good thing. I'm going to approach it from a little bit different angle today and kind of focus on some things you definitely do not want to do or mistakes to avoid. So for an agenda, I will do a brief introduction of my employer, Alithia, and myself, and then we'll jump right into it and get into the 5 things not to do. And I've actually added a few bonus items, so there's actually more than 5. And then we'll close with some final thoughts and some key takeaways. So a little bit about Alithia for those that don't know us. If you haven't heard of Alithia, you may have heard of Renzel or Edgewater Technology or Edgewater Renzel. Well, that essentially is Alithia's Oracle practice today after the acquisition. So a lot of the original founders of Renzel, original thought leaders are still with Alithia. And as far as our Oracle practice, you can see here that we have many years of experience and have done thousands of projects, even over 1,000 cloud projects. We're also proud to say that we have 9 Oracle ACEs at Alithia. And besides our implementation services, we actually offer a wide variety of other services, including not just EPM, but ERP, human capital management, supply chain, as well as obviously the enterprise performance management. In addition to that, we have managed services, as well as various offerings in the advisory services area. And the final thought here is we run our business on Oracle. So we not only implement Oracle for a living, but we run our shop on Oracle, ERP, HCM, and EPM. A little bit about myself. I have been with Alithia since 2014, but I've really been in this space, this EPM space, and working in master data technology since 2005. I am an Oracle ACE and also certified in EDM. And if you want to find out anything more, I did put the link to my LinkedIn profile here, as well as my own professional website where I post blogs about Oracle EDM. All right, so let's get into the meat of this presentation. So I'll start with just some easy no-nos. These are things that I think are common sense or obvious to most people. So I'll kind of get those out of the way, and then I'll go through 5 things. EDM for EPM and ERP, it doesn't matter, right? All dimensions must go in EDM. All mappings must go in EDM. The Big Bang Theory, and what's my pattern? And then I did throw in a bonus item. So to get some of what I think are the lower hanging fruit or more obvious gotchas or things not to do out of the way, let me start with this one. I don't hear this as much anymore, but occasionally I do. And that's when people say EDM is just DRM in the cloud, correct? And I would say no. I mean, at a high conceptual level, that is true. EDM is the cloud successor to the Oracle Hyperion Data Relationship Management on-premise product. But that's about it, because EDM was not a lift and shift of DRM to the cloud. EDM was essentially rewritten from the ground up. And what Oracle did is took a step back. They looked at what worked well with DRM, what didn't work as well, and they really built a brand new product with a different architecture and a different philosophy compared to DRM. The reason I mention this is if you are ever involved in a project where you're moving from DRM to EDM, be very careful to not bring and force a DRM mindset into how you want to set up and use EDM, because that will fail. It is a very different product, and EDM can do what DRM did, but it often goes about it in a different way. And so it's very important to have an open mind and really embrace the strengths of EDM rather than forcing how DRM did something. Or what I often tell my clients is let's focus on the what, the requirements, and not the how. Let's figure out the how in a way that leverages EDM's strengths. The second one, the adapters I choose for my implementation aren't that important. That is not true. And for those that are not familiar with EDM, it comes with several packaged adapters out of the box, including Oracle ERP, all of the EPM products, including planning, enterprise planning, freeform planning, FCCS, and enterprise PCM. The reason this is important is these packaged adapters come with a lot of functionality out of the box. So if you're setting up EDM for one of those target applications, it would be silly to not use the package adapter because you're going to get the benefit of a lot of pre-built content, pre-built properties, validations, out of the box integration capabilities. I mean, all of the core setup is essentially done for you, and you can focus your EDM implementation on the more advanced features and kind of configuring the workflows and those other functionality items of EDM. But definitely leverage the package adapters whenever possible. And then for those use cases where you need to integrate EDM with a application that does not have a dedicated adapter, EDM provides what is called the universal adapter. And that is essentially kind of a more generic blank slate of an adapter that's very flexible. It doesn't come with as many validations and integration capabilities, obviously, but it does give you the ultimate flexibility to design an EDM application for that target. Some examples where you might use the universal adapter include using EDM for, say, PeopleSoft or SAP or data warehouses or a Snowflake integration, things of that nature. Number three, every EDM project is purely a technical implementation, and I would strongly argue that is not true. And what I try to tell my clients when we're talking about implementing EDM, and this really applies whether they're migrating from DRM or migrating from another master data solution, or if they don't have any current master data solution and are implementing or going to a product like EDM for the very first time. It's very important to think about more than just the technical aspects of the project. And I tell clients, let's also talk about the people and the process aspects of it. And those are often more challenging for some clients and more important than even the technical deliverables of implementing EDM. And the reason I say that is depending on, and this varies, it's not as big a deal for many clients, but for other organizations, introducing a tool like EDM can bring a lot of change management that makes people very uncomfortable. They might be used to doing things a certain way, and now they're kind of being directed to make their chart of account hierarchy changes in a new tool called EDM, and it's very unfamiliar territory. So you want to be very aware of that. Think about the inevitable resistance to change that you may run into, focus on change management, and make sure that user adoption is at the forefront throughout the implementation by getting those key players exposed to EDM and get them using and comfortable with EDM as soon as possible. And then the last one, number four, EDM can only manage chart of accounts master data for Oracle systems. And this is also not true. First of all, EDM can do much more than just Oracle. Obviously, Oracle integrations are the sweet spot of EDM, especially with the adapters that come with the product. But you can implement EDM with non-Oracle, with cloud and on-premise systems. So we have implemented EDM with SAP, for example, or custom data warehouses. So it definitely is agnostic in terms of it can definitely support your organization, even if you have non-Oracle applications at play. And then the other thing is People think that EDM really can just manage the chart of accounts. Let EDM manage my hierarchies, my segment values, my dimensions for my ERP or APM applications. And obviously, EDM does that very well. But EDM can do a lot more than that when you talk about mappings, reference data, and then what has been a big push lately in terms of new functionality in EDM is operational master data. So, with mappings, EDM can manage mappings, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, but it can manage mappings for Oracle and non-Oracle systems. EDM can also manage reference data. So maybe it's not like a true chart of account segment you're trying to manage, but an important reference data set or a data repository that you want to manage in EDM and get the benefit of the EDM auditing and governance capabilities. That's a very good use case for EDM. And then with operational master data, EDM is expanding rapidly in this area with new functionality that would allow it to load, say, supplier or customer records from various systems and go through a series of matching rules and cleansing and deduplication processes to generate and maintain a supplier master or a customer master. So EDM is quickly branching far beyond just the typical financial chart of accounts use case. Okay, so let's get into the core of the presentation. So the first one is EDM for EPM and ERP. It's all the same, right? No, there's some big differences that you need to be aware of, and I learned some of these the hard way in my first implementation of EDM for ERP. And one of those is property inheritance. And the reason I bring this up, and I'm kind of thinking specifically with Oracle Cloud ERP in mind, but it kind of applies to Oracle e-business suite and potentially some other ERPs as well. But with Oracle Cloud ERP specifically, there really are two underlying data structures for each segment or dimension. There is a kind of a hierarchical data structure that manages the trees, and then there's a flat list structure that really just manages all the segment values. So you need to be careful because both of those data structures are pushed or exported out of EDM to Cloud ERP. And if you have a lot of functionality based around property inheritance or parent-child relationships or bottom nodes or not bottom nodes, you're going to run into trouble because those concepts are not applicable to the flat list data structure, and you may get unexpected results. Along with that, now EDM has added some functionality such as calculate and store on node names and properties that can mitigate some of those issues, but you do have to kind of be aware that if you're relying heavily on inheritance or anything that is based on a parent-child hierarchical structure, that you may not get the results you want when you look at the flat list data structure that EDM is maintaining. The second item is with EPM, we have the ability to just delete a member out of a hierarchy. Now, obviously, you have to be careful with that because you run the risk of losing data if there is data in the target EPM application for that member. But if a member does not have data and it won't be used anymore, you are safe to delete that member out of EDM. ERP works very, very differently. You never really delete a segment value out of ERP. All you really do is inactivate it. So it's just something to be cautious of. Often in our implementations, we will do actions such as disabling the remove and delete actions in our Cloud ERP viewpoints of EDM, or maybe have a validation that will warn the user about what they're trying to do. And then sometimes you may even want to configure your subscriptions and your approval policies to exclude or handle separately any kind of deletion related action in EDM. Because even if you delete that member out of EDM, It is not going to be deleted out of ERP even after you publish the segment values and hierarchies. It will remain in ERP even though it's gone in EDM. So just one of those differences compared to EPM to be aware of. Another one is tree versions. So with EPM, it is very easy to essentially spin up a new tree, a new alternate hierarchy, a new alternate rollup in our EPM applications. But with ERP, it's a very different process. It's a much more regimented, structured setup where you actually have to go into the application registration in EDM for the cloud ERP application and explicitly register those new tree versions. Give it a tree code, the name of the tree, kind of a start and possibly an end date of the tree version. So it's not something that you can just spin up through a new request like we would do on the EPM side. You have to kind of have an intentional update to the application registration to make sure those trees are registered correctly. In addition to that, one of the best practices we follow at Alithia is for every tree we register, we create both a current and a base version and keep those in sync. That helps support reporting and other functionality in Cloud ERP. So, just creating a new hierarchy or a new tree for ERP actually involves creating two versions of that tree in EDM for both a base and a current version. Another thing to be careful about is when you have alternate hierarchies, or even with your primary hierarchies, is having shared members. Because what you will find is that the GL base cube that sits underneath Oracle Cloud ERP does not allow shared members. So where, again, on the EPM side, we deal with alternate hierarchies and shared members all the time. Not with ERP. You do not, if you want the tree to load to the underlying S-base cube that's underneath Cloud ERP, you do not want to include shared members in that tree. It will not work. So it's just another difference to be aware of. And then the final point is ERP is not as forgiving for certain areas like it is with EPM, in that once you have published the segment values and hierarchies into ERP from EDM, there are certain properties specifically that you really can't change, or at least you cannot change without a lot of difficulty, a lot of rework, and a lot of time-consuming effort. Two that come to mind that we ran into in my first project, the account type and the summary flag. Once you have loaded an account with a specific account type, or have loaded any segment value with a summary flag of yes or no, it is extremely difficult to change that after the fact. So if you have a base member or a bottom node in EDM, for example, and you have the summary flag set to N or no, and you load that to ERP, and then later on you decide to add some child nodes underneath that member, therefore making it a summary flag. When you try to publish that the next time to ERP, you're going to run into issues. There are also extensive validations in EDM from the Oracle Cloud ERP adapter that will also check your summary flag value. So again, a summary flag value should not be set to allow posting or budgeting, for example, because you don't enter data at a parent or a roll-up member of a hierarchy. Or if you have a summary value, you want to make sure there are child nodes under that parent that truly make it a summary value. So again, just something to be aware of, that if something is set up incorrectly, you miscategorize an account, set it up as a liability instead of an asset, or you set up a member as a summary flag when it really shouldn't have been, you're going to have a lot of issues fixing that after the fact. Second item I wanted to talk to is dimensions. And this one might surprise people a little bit because I've worked with many clients that think, if it's a dimension, if it's a hierarchy, let's put it into EDM. Like, why not? And for the most part, I'm okay with that. That's true. But I like to take a little bit more of a thoughtful evaluation of that when I'm working with a client. And really it boils down to, is If EDM manages this dimension, is it adding value to that dimension in terms of enrichment and validation, in providing audit capabilities, helping to automate something that is not automated today, that kind of thing. So I'm not saying that we should never manage everything in EDM, but I also like to make sure that EDM is adding enough value to justify the effort to build it in EDM and manage the integration to the target system. And as a related note, you always have to consider the EDM licensing. Now, we have many clients, our large clients that have unlimited records and use EDM based on a hosted employee metric. But for those clients that are licensed by node count or record count, you need to be careful because if you're going to load dimensions that are larger into EDM, that would cause the client to exceed their record count. Eventually Oracle will notice and want to have a conversation, and you may look back and say, well, EDM isn't really adding a lot of value to that dimension. It's more of a pass through in pushing that dimension to the target. So why did we put that into EDM and introduce this licensing concern when we didn't really need to do it? So to help guide this, I established 4 dimension criteria that I like to walk through with every client. And the idea is there's always the obvious dimensions that should be managed in EDM, such as your GL accounts or your legal entities, your cost centers, departments, and so on. But there's always dimensions that maybe are on the fence and you're not quite sure if they should be managed in EDM or not. So what I try to work through with clients is these 4 questions. And if any dimension meets one or more of the 4 criteria here, then it very well should be an EDM. So those questions or criteria are, does the dimension change frequently? In other words, if something is very, very static and hardly ever changes, is it worth putting it into EDM? EDM can certainly do it. I'm not saying that, but is it worth the effort for something that rarely changes? Second one is the dimension shared across multiple applications. This is a big one. If you have a GL account dimension or a entity dimension that will be used across multiple applications, obviously that makes sense to put into EDM because you get all the benefits of EDM subscription capabilities, approval workflows, the validations, the integration and automation, and so on. Another criteria would be, are there just pain points in maintaining the dimension? The way the client is maintaining the dimension today, are things slipping through the cracks? Are dimensions being updated in a way that's causing impact to downstream systems or impacting reporting from downstream systems? If so, then that's definitely an area where EDM can help because we can introduce the approval policies and validations and other controls to help proactively manage that. And then the final point is, does the dimension require full transparency and robust auditing? And this could be more of a catch-all criteria, but maybe the dimension changes pretty often, but maybe it's not causing a lot of pain points, but it's important enough. It's a business critical enough dimension that you want to put it in EDM just to get the benefits of the auditing, just the full transparency into knowing everything that ever changed in that dimension or hierarchy. The EDM audit trail, which you cannot turn off, is extremely granular and it records every action ever done to a hierarchy, including when it was done, who did it, to what view and viewpoint. If you're changing a property value, it'll capture the before and after value. So it's an extremely useful feature that oftentimes can justify putting a dimension into EDM by itself. My final point on this is there typically are dimensions we never put into EDM, and those are what we call the POV or point of view dimensions. Again, you could put those in EDM, but we typically do not. And I'm talking about things like the scenario or version or period dimension, because those are pretty small, pretty static and also quite specific to a target application. So yes, we could manage that in EDM, but you have to ask yourself, is the juice worth the squeeze to put that into EDM? So we typically do not do that. But I would say besides that, the only time that in my experience we have not managed a dimension in EDM that maybe it could have would be because of the licensing concerns. So hopefully that makes sense. Going on to the next one, similar to the dimension question previously, but this is if it's a mapping, it must go into EDM, right? And let me be cautious on this one. And I have a lot of heavy disclaimers, and you'll hopefully see why in a couple minutes. I do not want to diminish or scare people away from EDM managing mappings because it certainly can. And the capabilities and functionality in EDM over the last couple years have grown tremendously in this area. So the key thing to realize is that EDM has really advanced in managing mappings just through the use of custom extracts and global connections and the ability to do pretty complex and advanced derived expressions in properties. All of that comes together to give you a very powerful mapping engine. So that's the first disclaimer. The second disclaimer is sometimes I run across a client who thinks that if EDM were to manage mappings, all it could really do is manage mappings for an EPM application. Maybe managing account to movement mappings for FCCS, for example. And it certainly can do that, and it does that well. But EDM can do much more than that, and it can handle ERP and non-Oracle mappings. In fact, we're working with a few clients, one in particular, where we are using EDM extensively to manage mappings, reference data sets, mapping sets, lookups for both Accounting Hub and Accounting Foundation in conjunction with an Oracle ERP implementation. So I just wanted to get that out of the way that EDM certainly has extensive capabilities in this area. But what I want to be also cautious with my clients about is you need to really understand how complex are the mappings going to be, and specifically in these situations. The first is multi-dimensional mappings. So we have kind of the single dimension or one-to-one mappings, I guess you could call them, where you're mapping, say, a legacy account to a new enterprise GL account. That's something EDM does very well. But multi-dimensional mappings are those situations where you have a combination of multiple segment values, say this account plus this department plus this entity plus this project equal a new target value. When you started to get into those multi-dimensional mappings, you need to kind of understand how complex are these going to be and how many exceptions exist in those mappings, because it could become very difficult to maintain. In addition to that, you can also start to explode the records inside EDM when you start thinking about EDM is going to maintain nodes or records that are essentially concatenations of multiple chart of account values or other segment values. So you have to be very aware of, what is the record count in EDM going to expand to if we do that. But really, to me, beyond that, the question is, are these mappings going to become so complex and so riddled with exceptions and exceptions on top of exceptions that it's really going to be a challenge to manage that in a kind of a user-friendly business user tool like EDM? Another situation we call mapping explosion, and that's where if you have a situation where, say, a client says, whenever I introduce a new GL account, I want EDM to automatically generate all new code combinations where that account may be used. And that can be a little bit tricky because EDM doesn't really have that mapping explosion capability, and it really isn't intended to do that. So again, it's a situation where I add a new GL account. I want EDM to generate, 10,000 new code combination mapping records with that new account with all permutations of other segment values. That can be difficult and sometimes gets into really what the third bullet point lists there, sub bullet point, in that When you get into those situations, you're starting to possibly drift into an area that might be better handled outside of EDM, where maybe you need to think about an external scripting solution. Maybe you do something in Groovy, for example, or maybe I just need, a dedicated ETL tool to do some of that complex transformation and explosion of records. Or maybe I have to do something in a SQL based solution. So it's just this whole slide is really about saying don't be don't think that EDM doesn't have the technical capabilities, but at the same time, be aware of how complex your mappings could be because you could easily get yourself into a situation where it has just become incredibly difficult to manage these mappings in a tool like EDM. My final point here is as far as the record count, again, that could be an issue if you're talking the mapping explosion where EDM is going to create thousands of records. Depending on how the mappings are set up, one thing that may offer you some relief is what we call the legacy GL node type. So this is a specialty node type that Oracle introduced to EDM quite a while ago. And the idea is that nodes that are created with this node type do not count towards your EDM license. They are not included in the record count. Now, they are somewhat restricted. You can't add custom properties to them. You can't just export them independently. So it is somewhat locked down, but it is a great way to set up a large number of mappings by using this legacy GL node type on the source mapping side of it to alleviate some of that licensing concern. All right. And again, just to kind of highlight my earlier point, and if it feels like I'm on the fence on this topic, you're probably right. And again, my point is I don't want to discourage people from using EDM for mappings, but at the same point, kind of be aware and kind of think about how complex this might be becoming. But anyway, this is an example at a client of our specific life where we are using EDM extensively for mappings. And this is just one example. We have many more mappings beyond what you see on this slide, but it's a case where we've almost set up almost like a star schema data warehousing approach in a way where we kind of have our primary mapping table that is used as kind of the main data entry point in EDM and where the extracts are published out of. But those are referencing a whole variety of supporting mapping tables. Almost think of these as like supporting attribute dimensions in a way. And the reason this worked very well is it allowed us to handle some very complex multidimensional mappings, but also avoid a lot of duplication of the data. So we can kind of establish these supporting reference tables for, say, accounts, whether it's GAAP or statutory, or for product groups, product types, transaction codes, and so on. We can kind of establish these reference tables of those key elements and their description and so on. And then using functionality inside EDM, like node data type properties, we can kind of pull it all together into that primary mapping table. So it kind of gives us the best of both worlds. It centralizes and simplifies to a degree the maintenance inside EDM into one primary mapping table, but also avoids a lot of duplication and repeating of data. So if you have to, change an attribute or a description on a specific mapping related attribute, you don't have to do it in 20 different places. You can go to that specific supporting reference table and update it once there. So anyway, this again, hopefully just kind of gets across that EDM can do some pretty advanced mapping capabilities, but just walk into it eyes wide open if you're going to attempt something like this and really trying to understand what is the use case and how complex might this become. All right, the next topic, the Big Bang Theory. It's always better to go Big Bang approach with EDM go lives, correct? Not necessarily. Now, I will caveat this with, in many cases, you have no choice. It could be to budget constraints, timing constraints, but EDM may be a part of a bigger initiative or project, and it is going to be a big bang go live. That's just the facts. And EDM can support that. But I just want to encourage you where you do have the flexibility, think about phased rollouts because to me there's some significant advantages to this. One of which is, you know, EDM's architecture, again, I keep mentioning is very different than DRM. So DRM is very centralized and top down. EDM is very decentralized and bottoms up. And EDM really, again, embraces this philosophy of these purpose-built adapters that are designed for a given target application and that support this data first view where I can configure an EDM, a dedicated FCC set of hierarchies. And I can also configure using the right adapter a dedicated set of hierarchies for enterprise planning or cloud ERP. So since EDM has this more modular approach, it really kind of lends itself well to more of a phase rollout because you can kind of build that foundation with EDM and then start to layer in additional EDM applications using the relevant adapters in kind of a plug and play approach. And then you start to connect the applications through the subscription mechanisms of EDM and the approval policies to kind of bring it all together. So, instead of a top-down approach, it's very much bottoms up and modular, which really can lend itself well to a plug and play phased rollout. Another reason to consider it is not just on the technical side, where you can just kind of, maybe have more bite-sized content that you were rolling out in a phased approach, but also the non-technical impact. Again, depending on the client, this could be a big change management issue depending on where they are coming from. So sometimes doing a phased rollout can actually lend itself well because you're more gradually introducing EDM to that audience and not just forcing a ton of change on day one. You can kind of introduce it in a staggered rollout to key groups of users with key sets of functionality, get them comfortable with the product, and then start to expand the rollout and the content that EDM is managing over multiple phases. Another reason is, I guess you can call it soft go lives. Sometimes what we will do if EDM is stabilizing well, we've gone through our integration testing, our user acceptance testing, the key administrators, data stewards and super users, requesters and approvers are getting very comfortable with EDM. But maybe some of the related work streams and the target applications that EDM will support are not quite there yet. There can be value to actually rolling out EDM early and essentially setting it up in production, even if its target applications are not all live and in production. Because again, you're kind of establishing that foundation and that mindset of I'm using EDM to manage my chart of accounts or my mappings. And I'm getting the benefit of EDM's audit capabilities and validations and data governance controls already, even though some of the target applications are still coming along. So it's something to consider. You have a little bit more wiggle room with EDM, depending on kind of the overall project and the flexibility of how things are going, where you might be able to roll out EDM earlier. The final thing is I sometimes hear from clients that they just think that I have to have EDM perfect on day one because what EDM does is so important. And I'm not arguing against that. Yes, what EDM does is very important. It's managing your chart of accounts, for example, which is really the backbone of your ERP and your EPM application. So it's incredibly important. But it doesn't mean you have to have thought through and accounted and configured for every possible use case or approval policy that might ever be needed based on a certain scenario that may come up later on. If you get the core foundational aspects of EDM in place with enough approval policy and data governance, enough validation, and enough training and knowledge transfer with the key users of EDM, you can go ahead and just understand that over time, I am going to add more functionality. I may introduce some more applications in EDM or more approval policies, but I'm going to do it gradually as those use cases come up and as my implementation matures and my users and administrators get more comfortable with EDM. So really the key takeaway is yes, EDM is foundational. The earlier you roll out EDM, the better, but it doesn't have to be 100% perfect and do every possible requirement you can ever think of on day one. Focus on the 80/20 rule and those core requirements to get it established. Okay, this one I'm calling What's My Pattern and Why Does It Matter? And really, this comes down, and by pattern, I mean the EDM application design pattern. So for those that are not as familiar with EDM, I've talked about adapters. So really, EDM has a somewhat unique architecture in that a single EDM environment will contain multiple applications, which might sound a little odd, but that's how EDM is designed to work. It is rare, if ever, to see an EDM application or an EDM implementation with just one application. You will often see 4, 8, or more applications. And we have done implementations where we have over 20, 25 plus applications in one EDM environment. And that is by design and how EDM is meant to be used, again, due to the adapters and that data first decentralized philosophy that it supports. So when you're thinking about all that, you also have to think about I want to leverage the adapters and this data first approach that Oracle promotes with EDM, but I also don't want to duplicate effort. I don't want to have somebody going into EDM that needs to add a GL account. I don't want them to go to 10 different places of EDM to add the same account. I mean, that defeats one of the primary purposes of a tool like EDM. That should be centralized and shared. And that leads to this question of the design pattern. And there's really two ways. I mean, regardless, you're going to have multiple applications in EDM. The question is, how do you kind of position and connect those applications together? And there's really two patterns, and they both are valid, and we've done both, and Oracle will tell you that both are 100% valid. So I'm not saying one is always better than the other. But to explain more about the patterns, on the left is what is called a nominating or originating application pattern. And the idea is that you have multiple applications. For example, you could think of maybe App A as an EDM FCCS application, App B as a planning application, and App C as an EDM profitability application. And for those dimensions that are shared, you're going to position App A or FCCS as kind of that originating application where, say, a new GL account gets added. And then through the subscription mechanism of EDM, that will be subscribed and synced over to App B and App C. And that's a perfectly legitimate pattern. And you could even start to mix it up where maybe based on another scenario or dimension, maybe App B is the originating application and it pushes out to App A or App C. That is also a valid scenario. So that's one approach. The other approach on the right is called kind of the front door or master application pattern. And the idea is you kind of set a front end or front door primary application, and we've started to kind of think of it as a master data hub application in a way. It's kind of the entry point for all of your master data changes to originate. And typically, the majority, if not all of your approval policies live in the front door application. And once those requests are fully approved, then the other applications, which I like to think of as deployment applications, App A, App B, and App C, receive the updates through the subscriptions. So you've kind of decoupled the data governance process from the actual deployment process that App A, B, and C are holding. So those are kind of the two general approaches. And the whole point of this slide is to kind of think about that up front and don't try to, over engineer or over complicate the implementation you might be working on or supporting if it doesn't need to be. So this next slide just has a few more talking points about this idea and some key considerations for each approach. And again, both approaches are valid. With the nominating or originating application approach, again, it naturally supports that data first philosophy of EDM, which is important. If you have an implementation of EDM that involves an ERP, you can often position that EDM ERP application as your de facto front door master application. So you can kind of dual purpose that application to be not only the entry point where changes originate and my approval workflows are housed, but it also serves as kind of a deployment application because it will publish the hierarchies to its ERP at the same time. So that definitely is a valid approach. As far as the user experience, you want to think about keeping things simple. And again, this will depend on how many users you have in EDM and how familiar are they with the master data, the hierarchies, the content that EDM is managing. If they're very savvy, very familiar with it, this can work well. But if you have some other users that really are not familiar with these concepts, all they know is I need to request a new GL account. I don't know necessarily what account type it should be or even where it should be placed in the hierarchy. I just know I need a new account. You want to make sure if you're going with the nominating approach, that you simplify as much as you can the data entry viewpoints in EDM to provide a very clean and simple user experience. You don't want to overwhelm them with lots of properties or maybe a very deep and complex hierarchy with lots of alternate hierarchies and rollups embedded in it. That can easily overwhelm a user that isn't really familiar with that and honestly doesn't need to be familiar with that. So it's definitely a valid pattern. Just keep these considerations in mind. And then the final point here, a multiple nominating application scenario is possible, but could get a little complicated and confusing. And by that, I mean, it's that situation, if you think back to the previous slide, where maybe for new GL accounts, App A is going to be my nominating application, but for legal entities, App B might be my nominating application. That may get a little confusing, and you need to make sure you're kind of setting up your views and your viewpoints in a very clean and organized way so that the users know where they need to go. When you think about the considerations for the front door application, one thing I've noticed is that my clients that are migrating from DRM to EDM love this pattern because it just kind of resonates well with them, and it helps ease the transition because, again, with DRM, you have a very top-down centralized tool to manage master data, and you're kind of switching to a very bottoms-up decentralized solution like EDM. So kind of positioning that front door application helps bridge that gap for many people that are very used to DRM. Another advantage of it is it not only kind of gives you that gold copy of your master data, if you will, like a single application really has that centralized gold copy of your master data, but it really kind of abstracts the whole approach, again, by separating the data governance from the deployment. So you're really positioning that front door application as a pure data governance engine, and that's its only function. It's not deploying or publishing any dimensions or hierarchies to target applications. It is purely there as a front door data governance process to get those changes originated and approved, and then they subscribe into the deployment applications for additional enrichment and then publishing to the target applications. One consideration, though, is you are going to be introducing another application in EDM, which, again, isn't bad, but just keep in mind there is overhead anytime you introduce a new application to EDM. It means additional subscriptions, node type converters, viewpoints, security considerations. You'll have to set up some security and permissions for that new application. And it's this kind of another data set that, it does offer that gold copy, yet at the same time, it is kind of another set of data that you have to kind of manage in addition to the master data that is contained in your deployment applications. So hopefully these considerations give you some food for thought on either approach. And again, there's no wrong answer. It's just a question of thinking about the requirements of your implementation and how best would these be used with that situation. The final thing I'll say on this topic is the tip at the bottom. The one thing you definitely do not want to do if you go with the front door approach is do not make the front door application look like Deer. And by that I mean do not throw every hierarchy, every property, every alternate rollup, anything that could ever be used into that front door application. That is really not efficient and is not going to work well. So you really want to think about keeping that front door application lean and mean in a way. And if you have, say, like an alternate rollup that is only used for, say, FCCS, may not make sense to put that in your front door application. If it's something that's very specific to FCCS, why not just manage that in your EDM FCCS application container? Now, if that alternate rollup could be used by other applications, or maybe you just want some more centralized governance, then yeah, maybe it does make sense to put it in the front door. But just don't think because it existed in DRM, I have to throw every property and attribute and validation and hierarchy into my front door application. You're just setting yourself up for a lot of headaches if you do that. All right, one final bonus item. Um, I already have EDM. There's no reason to keep up on new features, right? And I can't say I hear this a lot, but I sometimes get a sense that with some clients, we have EDM, we're good to go. We can focus on other things. And that's great because that means EDM is working well. But what I like to remind them is EDM is innovating so rapidly that it's in your advantage to stay aware of the changes that are coming out to EDM. Now, what Oracle has done, obviously there's monthly releases to EDM like there are all of the other EPM products, but once a quarter, typically, they do a very large feature drop with many, many enhancements. And it can vary, but the typical cadence is every March, June, September, and December. You will see a large number of new enhancements and features introduced into EDM. And to be honest, it's very exciting. It makes my job hard because it's hard to stay up on everything that's being added, but that's a good problem to have. But the point is, EDM is innovating so rapidly, and Oracle is putting just really innovative features into EDM. And now, of course, with AI being at the forefront of everything we talk about and hear about, you're going to see a lot of enhancements in that area. But you've also seen a lot of enhancements in data matching, for example, which gets into that operational master data, where EDM can really do a cleansing and deduplication and pattern matching to manage and maintain a supplier master, for example. Seeing a lot of enhancements in that area. Dashboards are seeing a ton of innovation, and these are all out of the box. I mean, you don't have to pay extra to use these features, so you might as well be aware of them. And things like the dashboards are providing a lot of analytics, a lot of graphs and trends that really show you how EDM is being used, who are your most active contributors, what dimensions are changing more frequently. I mean, there's just all kinds of interesting metrics and trends available by the various dashboards. So the point of this slide is if you have EDM and you love EDM, that's great. That's what I like to hear. But if you're working with an implementation partner, keep pushing them to say, okay, what are some newer things that have come out that maybe would help us? Or if you're just kind of maintaining EDM on your own, make sure you are subscribed to the Oracle communications, because every month they will send out a what's new email that lists out all of the new features that are coming to EDM in the coming release. All right, so just some final thoughts and takeaways. So the first one kind of touched this on this at the very beginning, and that again is be careful about forcing a DRM mindset into an EDM implementation because you are going to get frustrated and probably not be very successful. And really, what you have to do, and I had to tell myself this because I was a long time DRM implementation specialist. So I had to kind of relearn myself and remind myself of this. The key is to focus on the what or the requirements. Focus on what needs to happen and figure out the best way, the how to do that in EDM. Don't focus on how DRM did it and try to replicate that exactly in EDM because there might be a better or a different way to do that. So it's just about kind of keeping an open mind and really thinking of this if you're moving from DRM to EDM as an opportunity to really kind of declutter and maybe kind of clean up both your hierarchies and your processes, your properties and attributes, everything you do around maintaining your master data. Let's kind of, take a clean, fresh approach and really think about how can we best do this utilizing the strengths of EDM. And this really gets into the EPM cloud. It's just such a different world than the on-premise Hyperion. And again, it took me a while to get used to this, but I was so used to doing certain things in certain ways in my on-premise days, and I love being able to run SQL queries directly against the DRM database and all that stuff you can't really do anymore. But once you start to see what EDM is trying to do and how it kind of packages and solves that in different ways, it's actually a lot easier to work with EDM. And then you start to really understand ways you can expand and leverage the strengths of EDM. Takeaway number two, optimize the content that you are managing in EDM. And this kind of touches on different areas. So the first one again is I'm hoping people are realizing that you don't just have to manage your chart of accounts, segment values, and hierarchies in EDM. Obviously, it does that well. That's kind of its core use case, but it can do much more than that. It can do analytical and operational master data, as we've seen with some of that matching and deduplication functionality. It can do mappings for Oracle EPM, Oracle ERP, non-Oracle systems, and it can do reference data. I mean, we have clients that are managing reference data sets in EDM. It could be like, just industry lookup codes, or clients may want to manage in EDM maybe a list of properties or hierarchies or dimensions in EDM, along with like who is the primary and secondary owner and data steward for those different types of artifacts. So anything that could almost be captured in a data dictionary is a good candidate put into EDM because once it's in EDM, it's easy to look at, it's easy to download, it's easy to update, and you're going to get the benefit of the audit capabilities and also the approval workflows. And then the final point is if EDM is not mastering the content, meaning the content is not originating in EDM, but is being fed into EDM from another system, make sure you're really thinking through what is the value add of EDM in this situation. I'm not saying, again, don't do it. We do this a lot, but you want to make sure EDM is adding and enriching that content and not just simply passing through or handing off what it received and then pushing it out exactly as it received it to a target system. If that's all EDM is doing, you may want to think about would have made more sense to just push that directly to the target system and bypass EDM. Now, there could be advantages with the EDM integration capabilities that justify that, and that's an important use case. But just think about is EDM adding value either through integrations, enrichments, controls, workflows, auditing, even if EDM is not the source of truth or the originator of that content. If it is adding value, then yes, by all means, explore loading that through EDM, but avoid just using EDM as a pass-through because you may have built a lot of plumbing into and out of EDM for maybe something that isn't adding a lot of value. And the final takeaway is kind of gets back to that phased and big bang approach is I would say the earlier you can establish EDM as a foundational layer, the better. But also be smart about it. So again, I want you to keep in mind that EDM projects are more than just a technical implementation. They are a project that touches on the people and the process side of it. You need to keep the user adoption and change management in mind. And finally, you don't have to boil the ocean in the initial rollout of EDM. It doesn't have to solve every problem you can potentially think of may come up on day one. Get those core foundational requirements and capabilities in place. Start getting benefit out of EDM and then start to layer on additional functionality over time through additional phases. So again, I'm not saying delay your EDM rollout. The earlier you can roll out EDM, the better. It's just be smart about how you do that rollout. And with that, that is my final slide. So again, I thank you very much for listening to this webinar. I hope you got something out of it. If you do have any follow-up questions or comments, please contact us at the email address listed on this page. And again, thank you very much, and I hope to talk with you soon. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.